Thanks so much for joining us today on this Ethicast. I am Rebecca Furtick, a senior associate at Husch Blackwell in our Milwaukee office.
And I'm Catherine Hanaway. Rebecca, thanks for having me on today.
Absolutely.
And I am the chair of Husch Blackwell. And I'm in our St. Louis office. Both Rebecca and I practice in our white collar and internal investigations unit.
Well, thanks for joining me today. We're going to talk about an issue that is prominent across a variety of industries today, but DOJ enforcement. There's a lot been going on in that area. And there have been many recent pronouncements by the DOJ on the enforcement front, and we'll talk about one of them today. DOJ's emerging focus on personal devices and messaging apps. Can you share a little bit about what the government has been emphasizing in this area?
Well, I think a lot of people listening in will know that over the last few years, the Department of Justice has published and continues to refine the compliance guidance for ethical compliance programs, and then sort of questions that they've put together. ECCP is kind of the acronym being used, and Ken Polite, who's the Assistant Attorney General, Associate Attorney General, has been recently at the White Collar Bar Conference and talking a little bit about the most recent evolution of that guidance for effective compliance programs. And he really focused on ephemeral communications, messaging apps, and it's super interesting because a lot of people, including the Department of Justice, have previously spoken up on that topic. But what they had to say this time was a little bit different, Rebecca.
It was, and it was his remarks were actually striking because instead of just mentioning it as one of many issues they're looking at, he really tied it to what a company might receive as far as an offer to resolve criminal liability. I wrote this one part down because it was so striking from his remarks. You know, he said a company's answers to questions about their policies or their lack thereof may very well affect the offer it receives. So it's pretty serious. And my understanding is it draws upon September 22 guidance and remarks as well. So this issue's been kind of building for a while, it seems.
And the department's position kind of stands in contrast to, for example, the SEC's guidance on it, where the SEC essentially is prohibiting the use of ephemeral messaging apps on personal devices and to some degree within the business context. And so just to be very clear, what the Department of Justice is now providing in the way of guidance is to ask you to make an assessment of your company's risk profile. What are the chances that somebody's going to be using WhatsApp or Teams? And certainly there's a difference between using these ephemeral messaging applications and communications in a business context where you're able to capture and preserve those communications, for example, on Teams or Slack, and employees who are using them on their own devices, and then using ones that rapidly disappear, like on WhatsApp. And so what the department is asking is that you really make an assessment of how much risk you have, that you develop policies that are reflective of that, including, for the preservation of messaging, and then that you take actual remedial measures when somebody violates those policies. And what the department is saying is when they come in with an enforcement action, they are going to want you to have solid answers about how you've taken all those steps and, frankly, how you've trained on it. And I think that dictate from the Department of Justice really complicates things as people, and it's just a reality of life, use their own devices and their own means of communication, and the messaging apps are constantly evolving. And as a compliance officer, really thinking through how you're going to deal with this problem, I think will be one of the bigger challenges in the next couple of years.
Well, clearly DOJ has come up with a very substantial list of recommendations, requirements really for companies. Why do you think this has become such a recent focus for DOJ?
Well, because I think that they have encountered, as we have in working with our clients, that the employees are much as likely to communicate on their personal device as they are on their work device, which is like kind of mind-blowing, right? And you and I were talking about this earlier at lunch. You know, there are a lot of cases where we just kind of start with witnesses by asking them to surrender their phone. And that's a tough moment, right? And it's particularly a tough moment when the company hasn't set the expectation that somebody's going to give up their phone. And
a little bit of a shock.
Yes. And what they're all worried about is
spicier things on their phone. You know, your personal phone is called your personal phone for a reason. It has personal things on it. So for sure. And we were talking too about another reason this might have kind of come into focus more too is people are communicating more in writing and on these messaging apps since COVID too. You're not just going to run down the hall and talk to your coworker about something. You might message them. And you might use your other phone, or you have a phone that covers both your business and personal.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, I think in terms of practical advice, that moment when you ask them to give up their phone, you do need to spend some time reassuring a witness that you really don't care about text messages that they were sending about partying, even extramarital affairs, for the most part, usually aren't relevant to the kinds of investigations we're talking about, you know, financial misreporting, conflicts of interest, self-dealing, but it is sort of those embarrassing things that for the most part make that first moment of surrender really challenging. And so if you make those assurances as a chief compliance officer, unless you find behavior that is detrimental or discriminatory to your employees, you also can't seek any kind of vengeance for somebody who's, you know, maybe not living their life the way you live yours.
Exactly.
And you set a pretty high standard, Rebecca. So,
well, you as well. We talked a little bit about the shock value, or a little bit about how clients might react to hearing some of that. On the back end, or on the compliance perspective at least, what are you hearing from clients, or what do you see in terms of clients asking about how they navigate this space? What do they do now that DOJ is enforcing this more? Do they have to look at their policies more? Is there something they should be enforcing internally? What are you hearing?
Yeah, so I would definitely divide it into two columns. The easier column is anything that the business controls. So like Teams would be a great example of that. And you got to make sure that you have not only updated your policies to say that you're going to preserve communications in those formats, but also that your tech people have fully deployed the ability to do that. So, but on the business controlled side, that's the easy side, right? That's just a to-do list to check through. I think the very much tougher list is when somebody's got a personal device. And look, if somebody's got a personal device and they are really intentionally using it to communicate through programs like WhatsApp for the purpose of it disappearing, a lot of what you might do to prevent that in all likelihood may not be effective. So you now need to sort of think about, okay, let's assume there's an investigation of us by DOJ. What's DOJ going to be looking for? What are they going to think was reasonable based on the risk profile of our company? And I think the thing that's really important to remember is, unlike the SEC, unlike the FTC, DOJ is not a regulator, right? They aren't going to promulgate a reg that you can comply with. they're going to apply prosecutorial discretion as they investigate facts that come to their attention. So just to give kind of an extreme example, if you are a large medical system, large hospital system, and you have billers, probably the risk there is that they've maybe even been instructed to upcharge or miscode, and there's like False Claims Act risk, but it's probably that coming more from the management side, the chance that an individual biller is able to do something on their personal device that creates risk for the hospital system is fairly low, unless they've, we see crazy stuff in our practice. So,
no, that makes good sense.
The chance that they might, there's some chance that they might set up some side pay system with the patient, but that's kind of an extreme example.
Right.
On the other hand, and the other end of the spectrum, and this sort of raises other questions, but if you are a retail app, so a ride service, a food delivery service, all of your line employees are having very personal contact with people. And there's a good likelihood that they've gotten their information and can communicate with them in a side way, and that they may pose some risk to those individuals. And so, you really want to think through the extent of your liability for those gig employees, right? And then, what you can do to reduce the risk that they're going to have some kind of direct communication. So it's a complicated and kind of exciting new topic.
It is. And thankfully, DOJ, they kept emphasizing that there is no one size fits all. I mean, you presented two very different examples, and thankfully it appears that DOJ recognizes that there is not going to be one set of guiding principles that applies to every single company. But I'm going to try to put you on the spot just in my final question. Across industries, across companies, what are 2 to 3 maybe recommendations you have just in general that companies should consider for the rest of this year as they start to think about how to apply some of this guidance, think more about the guidance, and talk to their employees about it?
Yeah, so I'm going to give 2.
Okay.
The first is set these policies up long before you have a problem, so that you are conditioning your employees before they're up to no good to understand that their personal device may in fact be searched by the company. And the second piece of advice is to really use your data scientists to inform how you're monitoring even internal business communications for any signs that external devices might be being used. Things like I'll call you, I'll text you, that kind of thing showing up in email. But data scientists are smart, and they can really help you figure out some other ways to monitor those kinds of communications.
Well, thank you for that, and thanks again for joining us today as well. And thanks for being part of the show.
Thank you.